everything's going to be all right, and if it's not all right, it's not the end. And I love that. That's very hopeful, isn't it? So I was told today that I look like I dressed for Halloween in orange and black, and I did not do that purposefully, but it kind of goes with the fact that I'm going to tell you some corny Halloween jokes. So why didn't the skeleton like the Halloween candy? Because he didn't have the stomach for it. Which ghost is the best dancer? The boogeyman. Okay, what did the ghost say when the skeleton lied to him? I can see right through you. Okay, that's it. Okay. So today we are continuing to talk about this book called The Book of Joy, and it's written by Douglas Abrams, and it features Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who is a Christian, and the Dalai Lama, who is a Buddhist. And I have to tell you, because I always love how things work, that a few weeks ago I started with a book called The Five Invitations, and that was the book that I thought I was going to do a series on. But when I went to the library to pick it up, this book was sitting right next to that book, and it was just like, I had to get this book. And it ends up that this is the book that I'm really drawn to, because I love where this is taking us, because it's helping us to recognize those things that are standing in the way of our joy, but it's also helping us to recognize the things that we can let go of so that we can experience that deeper state of joy that is not always that happy, hey, hooray, but is that the joy that is talked about here is the joy that understands that whatever is happening, I can trust it, because I know that somehow it's working for the greater good, and it will work for the greater good. So in the book, he talks first about the 8 obstacles to joy, and they are fear, anxiety, and stress, frustration and anger, sadness and grief, despair, loneliness, envy, suffering and adversity, and illness and fear of death. The 8 pillars to joy are perspective, humility, humor, acceptance, forgiveness, gratitude, compassion, and generosity. So last week we talked about the first 2 that were the obstacles to joy. We talked about fear and anxiety and stress and frustration that can keep us from our joy. And I love this quote by Thich Nhat Hanh. He said, "Someone asked me, 'Aren't you worried about the state of the world?' I allowed myself to breathe." You know, that's a good thing when somebody asks us a question, is take a moment to go, before we just answer. And I said, "What is most important is not to allow your anxiety about what happens in the world to fill your heart. If your heart is filled with anxiety, you will get sick and you will not be able to help." And I just love that quote in expressing what we talked about last week. We also talked about, and this is a pillar to joy, about having the right perspective, and about how important it is that sometimes we step back or we rise higher and we get a broader perspective of things. And not just that, but that we're open to other perspectives. You know, one of the things that I love about having 9 people on our board of directors is I can go into a board meeting and I can think, I know what I feel and think about this. I know what my belief is about this. And I can get into that board meeting and have 3 different people share a different perspective. And I'm always like, I never thought of it from that perspective. So it's good to be open to other perspectives, because it's our opportunity to grow. And then the second pillar of joy that we talked about last week was the power of humility, the power of being humble, the power of knowing that I am not any more, but also that I'm not any less than anyone else. And this is like something the Dalai Lama, boy, he really talks about the one humanity, that we are one human. And when we can recognize that we all have the same experiences, just in different forms, we can more genuinely connect to each other, right? Yeah, and when we're not in a place where we're thinking we're more than or less than, we can more genuinely connect to each other. So that is a pillar to joy. So today on the obstacles to joy, we're going to talk first about sadness and grief, and then we're going to talk about despair. So it was very interesting to me. I am getting so much clarity out of this book. In talking about sadness and grief, because there's a psychologist researcher, his name is Joseph Forgas, that did a study that showed that mild sadness can actually have benefits. And that was really intriguing to me. Now, I'm going to get on my soapbox for just a minute here to say that I'm not talking about clinical depression here. And my soapbox is, if you've never been clinically depressed, you have no right to judge somebody who is clinically depressed, and you have no right to try to spiritualize them. That clinical depression is a very real thing, and oftentimes it needs medication for people to get to the place where they can start working their stuff. So I'm off my soapbox on that. Okay, so in this experience about mild sadness, what he found is that people had better judgment and memory, which was interesting, and that they were more sensitive to social norms, and they were more generous, actually, than the happier group. He also found that they were more discerning about their situation, they were more motivated to change their situation, and they were a lot more empathetic. And I think any of us, and probably all of us, have experienced sadness at some point, that when we've gone through something that has created that in our lives, we are much more empathetic, right? We understand what other people are going through. Okay, so sadness is actually an emotion that can create support and can create solidarity. So the Archbishop, I love this, the way he said it, he said that if our relationships are always hunky-dory, then a lot of times we don't really reach the depth in relationship. That really, and I think most of us would agree with this, that it's been through the painful times when we have kind of been broken open, and those things have just fallen away, and we've been able to be real. That is what really creates a deeper connection, right? Yes? Yes. Do you guys need some coffee this morning? I'm going to do a dance. Gonna get you awake here. Okay, so he said that a funeral is probably, a really good example of this, that when we come together in grief, we are just so present to each other, and we're willing to just be open and to hug each other, to touch a shoulder, to say kind words to each other. And that's important. And, we don't have to wait to get to that place of sadness and grief to be able to be there with each other and to be real with each other. I think that's so much of what this book is about. Now, the other thing that he talks about with grief is that when we are in a place of grief of losing someone that we love, this is the Archbishop Desmond Tutu said that what we can do is we can look at that person's life and say, well, what were they about? Like, what was the message of their life? And we can choose then to carry that message forward. We can choose that, I really want to honor this person by, expressing more of the message. The other part of that is that we may have a message to share. And so when my husband, Sean, died in 2014. He died of complications of alcoholism. And he was very open about his alcoholism. And, when I came back, I was just like strong about the message that he was not a drunk. He was not some person to just be dismissed, that it was not a character defect, and that it's a problem with the brain. And that was so important to me to share that message, because I've seen so many people dismissed in my life as addicts and alcoholics as though they aren't even worth looking at. And that's not true. So my point being, there's always a message that we can carry forward somehow in honor of those who have passed on. And I love this quote on grief. Grief is the last act of love we have to give to those we loved. Where there is deep grief, there was great love. And it's really true, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, so the second obstacle to our joy is despair. Now, the Dalai Lama talks about the fact that we are bombarded with news that is so good all the time. I'm checking to see if you're awake and you're listening. We are not bombarded with news that is good all the time. We are bombarded with the worst of the worst news, right? And we can lose hope in humanity. In fact, I've heard people say, I've really lost hope in people. And our job is to focus more on the good than we focus on that which is not working. And he gives the example, that there are millions and millions of parents who love their children. There are millions and millions of teachers who want to do the right thing with the children. There are millions and millions of nurses and doctors who are there to serve and to take care. And his point being that, that we can look at what's not working and say how terrible it is that these things aren't working, but that at the same time there are many, 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 many more positive things happening in the world than there are negative things. It's just what is sensationalized. But when we look around, we can see that there are so many good things happening, right? Absolutely. And I love this. He said, we've always got to be recognizing that despite the aberrations, the fundamental thing about humanity, about humankind, about people, is that they are good, that they were made good, and they really want to be good. And imagine if we walked around with that attitude, that we could look at people and remember that about them. And it's either next week or the week after that we're going to talk about more about how we can show up in that way. Okay, so those are the two obstacles. So the two pillars to joy, the first one is acceptance. And this is an interesting one because this is one that I think people, especially in kind of New Thought, struggle with, because there's that thought that if I accept what is today, I'm inviting it into my life. So I want to give you a different paradigm today. Acceptance is really the only place where change can begin. And it says once we can see life in its wider perspective, once we are able to see our role in its drama, does anybody see your role in the drama of your own life? With some degree of humility, and once we're able to laugh at ourselves, we then come to, and this is the fourth and final quality of mind. The first four are qualities of mind, but I switched this around because I'm doing laughter last, which is the ability to accept our life in all of its pain, imperfection, and beauty. And acceptance, it's important to be noted, is not resignation. So the Archbishop says that we are meant to live in joy, but this doesn't mean that every day is going to be happy, happy, joy, joy. It doesn't mean that we're not going to experience the pain of life. In fact, is there anybody here today who has never experienced pain, sorrow, suffering? Yeah. That's just part of our life experience. But the thing that we do when things come up for us that are painful is we want to push them away, right? I mean, in our humanness, this cannot be happening. This is not happening. I'm not going to look at it. And really what he's saying here is that our greatest power is when we turn and we face it. And I love this. He said, it means that we can turn our faces to the wind and accept that this is the storm that we must pass through. Wow. That's a lot different than we usually kind of navigate through things, right? I'm going to turn right towards this and I'm going to know. But here's the thing, you guys, is we know that we are going to have storms in our lives. We know that that's going to happen. It's a natural order of things. And here's the other thing. We can look back in our lives and we can say, wow, that thing that I thought was the worst possible thing that could have happened to me has been the best possible thing that could have happened to me. Or I've grown tremendously out of this thing, right? We all have that where we can look back and we're grateful. We're like, thank God. I mean, I think how many times I'm like, thank God that happened, because I would have never thought to create it myself, but the universe helped get me there. So what if? What if when things occurred in our life, we took the hit initially. I'm always about, hey, we're going to feel it. But because we're so anchored, because we've done our work, and this is a big thing, especially that the Dalai Lama talks about, if we do our work, and we create that anchor and that foundation, we're more quickly going to come back to the center. And what if we turn to it and we said, I'm going to co-create this experience. I'm going to be part of the process of the unfoldment. And gosh, I wonder what blessings are going to come out of this, because I know all the blessings that came out of that. So there's guaranteed blessings on the other side of this. Can you imagine? Like, I want you to imagine it. I want you to imagine that, because that's where we can get, where we can look at things and we can embrace them and we can know that they're for us. Because what we teach in Unity is that no one and nothing is against us. But how much of our life do we spend in that place where we're like, this is against me. This is against my family. This is against something. We go back to principle. No one and nothing is against me. I can trust this, and wow, I can't wait for the blessings to unfold. And I want to encourage you to work with that, because all of us can get there. We can all get there. The second, before I go on, because he said that also so much of our suffering comes from and not accepting people. Anybody here have a hard time ever accepting people around you? Okay. But he said when we stay locked in judgment and criticism, that is a huge obstacle to our joy. So he uses the example of maybe you have kind of a curmudgeon neighbor, cranky neighbor. And our humanness is like, we're judging them, we're criticizing them, we're making them wrong, we're telling people about them. But he said that's an obstacle to our joy. And he said what we could do is we could have compassion for them, and we could share kindness with them. And, Scripture tells us we can pray for them, and we can pray for their goodness and for their heart, because the reality is when somebody's like that, they're really suffering. And we're going to talk more about that next week. And then the thing that he goes on to say is, you know what, it may not change the situation, but it changes, it changes us. And I want to ask you, because this has happened in my life, I've had people tell me how much it's happened in their lives. When you have changed your mind about someone, have you found that the people tend to change? Oh my gosh, that's happened so many times to me. And it's not always going to happen, but I'm going to tell you, no matter what, the journey is your journey, because we can't really change somebody else's journey is your journey. But this is your journey, and we want to really embrace those pillars of joy. Okay, so that's the third pillar of joy. Okay, so the last one that we're going to talk about today is laughter. That laughter is the fourth pillar of joy. So since laughter is the fourth pillar of joy, I do have some more jokes for you. So having just moved into his new office in Whitehall, this pompous, newly promoted lieutenant commander, Rodney Grant, he was in the Royal Navy, was sitting at his desk when the leading Seaman Jones knocked on his door. And so particularly aware of his new position, he picked up his phone and put it to his ear, and he said, come on in. And then he said into the phone, "Yes, Admiral, I'll be seeing him this afternoon, and I'll pass along your message. In the meantime, thank you for your good wishes, sir." And he hung up the phone, and he said, "What can I do for you?" And without batting a lash, Jones replied, "Nothing important, sir. I'm just here to connect your new telephone." Okay, so Maria was driving home one day in New Mexico, and she saw an elderly Apache woman on the side of the road walking. So she stopped and she asked her if she wanted a ride. And the woman just nodded, and she got in the car, and Maria tried in vain to strike up a conversation with her, but it just wasn't happening. And the woman was just really checking everything out in the car. She was curious about everything. And her eyes came up on a red bag with a bow on it. And so she looks at Maria and she said, "What's that?" And Maria said, "It's a bottle of gin for my husband." And the elderly woman looked at her, and then she looked straight ahead and just thought for a moment. And then just in her just wonderful elderly Apache wisdom, she looked at Maria and she said, "Good trade." But I cracked up when I read that. I cracked up when I read both of them, really. Okay, so the question was asked of the Dalai Lama, can you tell us about the role of laughter and humor in the cultivation of joy? And he's laughed. If you know anything about the Dalai Lama, the man is always smiling. He's always laughing. He is so about joy. And I want to tell you, he's about practice, spiritual practice. And we talk about this a lot, but this is what is so important, that if we practice, if we do our spiritual practices, we're going to be more apt to be able to live in this deep state of joy. So he said laughter and joking is much better, because when we're laughing and we're joking, we're more relaxed, right? Absolutely. And we also know, and we've talked about this before, laughter and humor is good for our bodies. Literally, he was saying that people who are always laughing have this sense of abandon and ease, but people who are kind of acerbic, people who are very serious and they don't connect well with people, they're more prone to heart attacks. That literally laughter is good for our heart, it's good for our lungs, and it creates all these great, drugs in our body that are natural drugs to make us happy. And so they asked the Archbishop, can you tell us how about the ways in which humor can bring us together and in our shared ridiculousness? And he said, that if you want to bring people together, you do that through humor. You're not going to do that by being a very stoic person. And he said a lot of people think that they have to be that in order to be respected. But that generally creates distance, doesn't it? When somebody, kind of shows themselves as being almost better than, it almost creates distance. And he said, ultimately, I think that it's our ability to laugh at ourselves and not taking ourselves so seriously, that it's not about belittling humor that puts other people down by any means, but that we have to be able to laugh at ourselves in our shared humanity. And I thought that is so true. And last night I had somebody text me to ask about homework for the class, and she had just written the word teacher on her homework, and she texts me and she says, I just wrote this word down and I have no idea what the homework is. And I was cracking up, and I texted her back, and then I said, well, today I went to the grocery store and I had my grocery list, and one of my items just said frozen. I had no idea what Frozen was, because I wasn't buying the Frozen movie. I did finally figure it out, but I was able to text her back and say, oh my gosh, this happened to me today. It was humor. We could laugh at ourselves in our shared humanity. And that's important, isn't it? Because when we share those things, we recognize, and this is what the Dalai Lama is all about, we're one human. We really are one human. And we all have these experiences. So I'm going to be very vulnerable today, and I'm going to be very humble today and share with you an experience that I had up at Unity Village this past week. Paul and I were up there, and I had just come out of the restroom, and I was walking by, and he just goes, honey, stop. And I said, okay, and he goes, just turn a little to your left. So I turn a little to my left, and he's got his camera, and he's taking a picture. And then I see this kind of smile on his face, and he takes another picture, and he goes, and in the meantime, I'm like, what? And I'm feeling, my shirt out or something. And then he says, turn around. And at this point, I'm like, no, I'm not turning around for you to take a picture. So this is what he took a picture of. Oh, hold on. If you can see, there's 8 sheets of toilet paper coming down the back of my... Has anybody else ever had toilet paper down? Don't shake your head, no. But we died laughing. We were laughing so hard, and I was just so grateful that it was in our room, and I wasn't in a public restroom, all walking around, it's just toilet paper, And the thing is, I told him, I'm like, because he loves to take pictures and put them on Facebook. Sometimes I'm like, what? So I'm like, you cannot put this picture on Facebook. This is not going on Facebook. And after the first service, somebody came up to me and said, you do know the talk goes on Facebook. And I'm like, dang. But my point being, we all do that. Maybe you don't do that, but it could happen to you. There, but by the grace of God, go you. So it's just a good thing to laugh. and to, share our ridiculousness. So in closing, I just want to encourage you to do your best on focusing on what's good in the world, seek that out. And I'll tell you, I find a lot on Facebook of just good news stories, and I love that. They just make me feel good, and I like sharing those. But seek out what's going good, because there's so much good in our world. Accept what is. You know why? Because it is. It's right there. But remember that acceptance is not resignation. Acceptance is actually possibility. And laugh. Laugh at yourself, bring more humor into your life, and share that humor. And next week, we're going to talk about loneliness and envy and forgiveness and gratitude. Just tiny little things. Forgiveness is just a tiny little thing that we have to talk about. So in the meantime, I say to you, namaste, namaste.